million people gather in the center of Beijing. They're demanding change. The protesters call for democracy and an end to corruption. They're the greatest threat China's leaders have faced. But then, in just one night, the crowds are crushed. Thousands are gunned down. It's a defining moment. All traces of what happened are erased. It's an event that China wants its people and the world to forget. Everything changes in China after that one day in 1989. But the story of what happened in Tiananmen Square begins much earlier. It's 1976, and the founder of modern China, Mao Zedong, has died. And with his passing, the Cultural Revolution also ends. The Cultural Revolution can only be described as a period of chaos. When it was launched a decade earlier, the ruling Communist Party said its aim was to purge the country of what it called capitalist influences and archaic traditions. But in reality, Mao wanted to eliminate his enemies, real or imagined, and was determined to reassert his control over the party following the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. Armed gangs roamed the country, attacking people for wearing bourgeois clothes. Imperialist signs were torn down, and intellectuals, teachers, and party officials were exiled. This included a 15-year-old Xijinping who was sent to the countryside to carry out manual labor. The Cultural Revolution crippled the economy, ruined millions of lives, and thrust China into 10 years of anarchy and stagnation. Even the Communist Party admitted it was a failure, but only years after Mao's death. During a convention in 1981, the Central Committee said the Cultural Revolution had caused the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the country, and the people since the founding of the People's Republic. But things were about to change. In 1978, this man emerged as the de facto leader of China. This is Deng Xiaoping, and he had a plan to clean up the mess left by Mao. Deng introduced a concept known as Boluan Fanzheng, which means to bring order out of chaos. The plan was to reverse the policies of Mao under the Cultural Revolution, to introduce economic reforms and open up China to the rest of the world. This was radical. Instead of obsessing over ideology, the new policies would focus on growing the economy, foreign investment, and modernization. One of the people that would help Deng to achieve this would be Yaobang, who is pivotal to our story on what happened on Tiananmen, but more on him later. So things start to change in China in the 1980s. After 30 years of isolation, the doors are suddenly flung open. Foreign ideas, politics, music, and culture sweep the country, and thousands of students and scholars go abroad to study and exchange ideas. And people were emerging out of poverty, private business was encouraged, and tourists were welcomed to the country. And it all paid off. As a result of Deng's reforms, the economy grew rapidly, increasing by a massive 9.5% each year. But with this sudden newfound wealth came new problems. The people that were getting rich and getting the best jobs were mostly government officials. Anyone else was locked out. Salaries were uneven, inflation was high, and there was a growing frustration over what many saw as corruption within the Communist Party. Deng's reforms were a double-edged sword. Yes, the country was modernizing and the economy was growing, but people were also exposed to new cultures and ideas and began to debate things like democracy. Some even openly questioned the ruling party. This was unthinkable during Mao's era, where anyone suspected of defying the party was thrown in jail or worse. And remember that Mao had died only a few years earlier, so the speed of this transformation was rapid. But not everyone was happy. Many of the hardliners in the party were alarmed by the foreign influences. They decried the invasion of Western culture as spiritual pollution. Now, many of you are familiar with the protests that happened in China in 1989, which culminated with Tiananmen Square. But you might not be aware that 3 years earlier there were also huge pro-democracy rallies. Tens of thousands of students took to the streets in 1986 in protest against the ruling party. They filled the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, and several other cities.
It's our duty to spread the idea of liberty or democracy So that's our goal.
The 86 protests were heavily influenced by this guy. Fang Lijie was a professor of astrophysics and had taught at Princeton, but he was also an outspoken critic of socialism. Fang said that democracy is a right and not a gift from above. What was given can be taken away. What was won cannot. Fang made frequent speaking tours across China, where he gained many followers and supporters, especially among students. His liberal ideas would also inspire students to march on Tiananmen Square. It's also worth mentioning what was happening around the world at this time. Dictators in the Philippines and Haiti were overthrown. There were mass student protests in France and political liberalization in Taiwan. So it's not unlikely that students and intellectuals in China were influenced by these world-changing events. The government was caught off guard by the protests. The conservatives wanted a forceful response, but Hu Yaobang, the general secretary of the party, took a more lenient approach. This decision would cost him dearly. There were a few arrests, but a violent crackdown didn't come, and after a month, the protests fizzled out. The response to the 86 protests revealed deep divisions within the Communist Party. On the one hand, there was the old guard that had served for decades under Mao and rejected political reforms. On the other, there were people like Hu Yaobang, who were more progressive. Hu was handpicked by Deng Xiaoping to be general secretary of the party and was groomed to be his successor. Hu was relaxed about the foreign influence in China at the time. He believed it was in China's interest to experiment with new ideas and to create a new image for Chinese communism. But the conservatives also had personal reasons for opposing Hu. That's because Hu wanted them out. He believed they were political dinosaurs and often urged them to retire, so they were looking for any excuse to get rid of him. The hardliners in the party also blamed Hu for the protests in 1986 and were appalled by his tolerance. They conspired to have him removed. They convinced Deng that Hu was too weak to lead, and on January 16, 1987, Hu Yaobang was forced to resign. But the removal of Hu would backfire spectacularly on the party. Following his dismissal, the party launches an anti-liberalization campaign. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle and the people didn't want to go back to the old ways. Maoism had lost its appeal and the campaign failed. And it wasn't just in China. By 1989, communism was on the retreat in Eastern Europe. There were strikes and protests in Poland, Hungary and Romania. It seems people had had enough of authoritarianism. The year also had historical importance for China. It was the 40th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic and the 70th anniversary of the May the 4th movement, a student-led campaign against imperialism. Then on April 15th, Hu Yaobang dies of a heart attack. Hu was loved by students in China who saw him as the champion of reform. Mourners gather in Tiananmen Square and demand that Hu's name is cleared. But this quickly transforms into protests, with the students calling for freedom of speech and an end to corruption. Within days, the numbers swelled into the thousands, and the pro-democracy protests spread to cities and universities across the nation. At this point, it's not clear how the government will respond. But Zhao Ziyang, the new general secretary of the party, urges restraint and tolerance. On April 26, the government makes itself clear. It publishes an op-ed in the People's Daily, the official newspaper of the party, and in it the student protesters are denounced as agitators that must be stopped. This enrages the students, and the following day, up to 100,000 people march on Tiananmen Square. The students receive support from workers, journalists, actors, and even some members of the armed forces. Zhao tries to get the editorial reversed or toned down, but to no avail. He later promises the students that the government will speak to the protesters, a key demand of the students. In the middle of May, the protests escalate when the students in Tiananmen begin a hunger strike. They say they have no choice because of the government's failure to respond to their requests for talks. On May 15th, Mikhail Gorbachev arrives for a state visit. It's the first trip by a Soviet leader to China in 30 years. But the government is hugely embarrassed. Due to the scale of the protests, Gorbachev is unable to visit popular attractions like the Forbidden City, and his movements are highly restricted. On May 19th, Zhao visits the square, by which time around 1 million people had now gathered. He makes a last-ditch effort to persuade the students to end their hunger strike. It seems he knows what's about to come.
另外，你们也知道，北京的情况也不能再继续下去了。我们这个城市啊，又是首都啊，各方面现在严重的情况啊，一天一天在增加。
The speech is incredibly powerful and emotional, and I recommend you watch the whole thing. Unfortunately for Zhao, that will be his last political act. Following his speech, he's sacked as General Secretary of the party and placed under house arrest. The next day, martial law is declared. Around 500,000 soldiers are deployed to the outskirts of Beijing. They're reinforced by tanks and armored personnel carriers. But the soldiers are unable to get to the square because they're blocked by the protesters and their supporters. For the next week, nothing happens. The protests in Tiananmen continue. The students have no idea of what's about to come. On the evening of June 3rd, soldiers and tanks move toward the square from 3 different directions. They open fire on anyone they see. The students on the square can hear the approach of gunfire and are frozen with shock. The last demonstrators gather around the monument to the people's heroes at the center of Tiananmen Square. In the early hours of June 4th, tanks and soldiers charge the square, targeting the remaining students. The protesters fight back with sticks and rocks. There's chaos and confusion. By dawn, the carnage is over. The army now has complete control of Beijing. But there's one final act of defiance. A man walks in front of a column of tanks along Chang'an Avenue, which leads to Tiananmen Square. It's the defining image of the protests. To this day, the fate of the man remains unknown. On June 9th, Deng Xiaoping appears in public for the first time since the bloody crackdown. He praises the military and blames the turmoil on what he calls counter-revolutionaries. Mass arrests immediately follow, and there's a purge of the ruling party, from high government figures to local officials. Journalists working for state media are also targeted. No one is spared. Thousands are imprisoned. There's almost universal condemnation of what happened at Tiananmen Square. Around 1 million people in Hong Kong immediately protest the crackdown. The US and the European Union imposed an arms embargo on China in response to the violence. The government has suppressed all information related to the protest and its violent response. And it's refused to publish any details of the victims or offer compensation to their families. China has effectively erased all records of what happened at Tiananmen Square. Now let's talk about the legacy of Tiananmen. The 1980s was a unique period in modern China. The government opened up the country for the first time and experimented with economic and social reforms, and it seemed that the horrors of the Mao era were finally over. But the changes came too quickly for some in the party. The Communist Party was ready to change economically, but not politically. The legacy of Tiananmen is that extreme censorship and political repression had become the norm in China. Xijinping won't tolerate any kind of opposition or dissent. It seems that above all else, Xi wants control at any cost. The Communist Party took a gamble in the 1980s that it won't ever risk taking again.